how does Ansible Automation Platform and APIs come together? So Ansible Automation Platform itself, the product, has an API. So any feature or component can be fully automated, whether it's event-driven Ansible, private automation hub, or automation controller. No matter what feature or capability you're using, it can be fully programmatic by using that API to automate any processes or job templates or workflows that you want to turn on or off. So when would you use that? If you have something like ServiceNow as your front end, like an ITSM ticketing solution, and someone opens a ticket, it can talk directly to Ansible Automation Platform within your workflow so that it kicks off automation for your IT infrastructure. And then going the other direction, it could use a ServiceNow content collection to talk directly to ServiceNow, which is also an API. So a lot of people are familiar with how Ansible Automation talks to Linux servers that uses the SSH plugin. It's very common for us to use SSH. It's the default standard for most modules. But when we have different platforms that SSH doesn't quite make sense or it's not the norm, we typically talk to their API. So for AWS, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, all of those have standardized SDKs and APIs that we talk to, and we have certified content collections that allow us to talk to them. So people can just write a normal playbook, just like they would for a Linux server or Windows server, but now they're just doing it where the connection plugin is kind of agnostic to them. It's just using the API versus SSH. Now, there's also a third category where, like, hey, this particular application, maybe it's proprietary or it's not well known and there's no content collection for it yet. We actually have a built-in URI module that's part of the Ansible distribution that allows us to talk to any API and write playbooks. It doesn't look as quite as condensed as some of the other certified modules because you have to understand like HTTP codes, but it's really easy for anyone that's interacted with any API to write custom Ansible playbooks in an easy to digest manner for them to be able to automate anything. So APIs are super important for Ansible automation, and it's because it's the way disparate systems talk to each other. It's just a really easy way. And honestly, we're not even limited to just APIs. Like we have different connection plugins for network infrastructure. So gRPC, NetConf, typically network CLI as a connection plugin. So our partners and ISV vendors, they're allowed to write content collections where they can use any connection plugin they want. Playbooks are completely agnostic from the connection, but APIs are one of the most standardized ones that I've seen across many different platforms and applications. Way to structure API calls and use this capability with Ansible Automation Platform. So really you can treat API calls just like a disparate task within an Ansible playbook. It's really easy to write an API call. It can be just one task within an Ansible playbook. The biggest thing you have to take in consideration when you're doing API calls is authentication to those systems, whether or not it needs to be like SSL driven and you verify it, or that needs to be ignored if you're in a testing environment, and then how you're storing that token, that username and password, and whether you need to use encryption or use something like HashiVault or CyberArk to actually integrate with Ansible Automation Platform. We're more than welcome to store your passwords with Ansible Automation Platform, but we also work with a variety of different tools out there that are standardized in different environments to store those tokens, usernames, passwords, keys, whatever you happen to authenticate to that API. So it's just kind of thinking about what is this workflow, who needs access to this workflow application, this playbook in this case, to talk to something, and then how does that playbook get access to credentials to actually talk to that system, and then is that person allowed to do that function? So that's part of like RBAC, role-based access control. So obviously if I had a playbook talking to the AWS API, I would want to make sure that that user is actually authenticated and allowed to provision VM instances, or I might get an AWS bill that I don't want at the end of the month. So what are some perks of Ansible Automation Platform and using it with APIs? And one of them is it lowers the barrier to entry. You don't have to write a custom application. You don't need to know how to write Python code or Go code or Rust code to actually create an application or a Flask application to do something cool with an API. You can just create a playbook. And playbooks are a very low barrier to entry. It's a very easy, it's tons and tons of people know how to write playbooks, and there's tons of documentation, examples, samples, demos, workshops, including the ones we have at Red Hat that you can take on redhat.com. But it's just really easy for you to actually write a small 5-task playbook that completely configures something by its API. It's just a really simple and elegant way to interact with APIs without having to like really again write any code or use some sort of application to like tie those APIs together.